Story 1. The height of the AIDS epidemic was in the early 1990s. In 1992, it was the leading cause of death in men between the ages of 25 and 44. A sexually transmitted disease was the leading cause of death. How wild is that? Very dark times that often don't get talked about because of the unjust stigma around it. Story 2. If you missed the airing of the new episode of your television shows, you were just out of luck. You'd have to wait until they ran reruns at some point months or years in the future, or hope someone you knew recorded it. Story 3. It was the last decade where crime was truly an epidemic in the United States. That's not to say there isn't crime today, because there obviously is, but crime was a massive problem for pretty much every United States city with at least a decent-sized population. Especially gang-related crime. It wasn't until the late 1990s that it began to dip and then continued into the 21st century before an uptick in 2020 or so, which still didn't rival what we were experiencing around the mid-1990s. It's fun to glamorize the decade and how prosperous it felt, but there was definitely a real struggle there for a good chunk of American inner-city communities. Story 4. The rampant homophobia was pretty ingrained. It was completely normal for television personalities and comedians to make jokes where the only punchline was that the other person was gay, which was an insult. Story 5. Managing your bank account and checkbook was a hassle, but it also let you write checks a couple of days before you got paid, as they took a while to clear. It was like your own little payday loan. Everything else I can think of was better in the 1990s. Looking up information in a library had no ads. Movie theater listings were simple. Everyone had pensions. Everyone watched the same TV shows at the same time. There was no social media. Dating was easier. Healthcare access was easier. Access to higher quality food was easier. Entertainment was cheaper. People got together in real life instead of yelling at each other on screens. There was less content filler on network news. Journalism was a career. Fewer tiers and VIP access nonsense for theme parks. Better access to abortion. School was cheaper. Houses were cheaper. Yes, your TV was smaller, but it lasted longer and it didn't have to boot up when you turned it on. Yes, there were fewer channels and fewer video games, so we did this crazy thing. Read books. I can objectively say that everything has gotten worse except the price of consumer electronics, which has led to a massive amount of electronic waste. So, I wouldn't call the past 30 years much of progress at all. Story 6. Bill Clinton remade the Democratic Party from New Dealers into conservative neoliberals. The Democratic elected leadership has, for the most part, still not broken from this Reagan-influenced ideology. Story 7. If you missed an episode of a show, you were out of luck. You could plan your life around one particular show schedule, but if there was a storm that rolled through Thursday night and knocked out the power for an hour or two, you missed out on Carter and Lucy being stabbed on air, and then you're stuck next week trying to put the pieces together. There was no catching that episode again unless you happened to catch it in reruns in the off-season. What's worse, when those reruns air, they're often aired in no particular order, so you have to read through a TV guide each week just to see if you can figure out when the episode is going to be on. Story 8. Besides homophobia, people with mental illnesses and conditions were often made fun of. Conditions like autism and Asperger's syndrome weren't well understood, and if a kid displayed those symptoms, they were often just called the weird kids and other much more derogatory names and pushed to the side. Story 9. The amount of fads. Not to say they were all bad, but things just got oversaturated. Everyone wanted to create the next best thing. It was just too much. Story 10. The fall of Yugoslavia. Rwandan genocide. Ruby Ridge, Waco, Oklahoma City bombing. Columbine. AIDS and associated rise in homophobia. The 1990s was definitely a prosperous time, but the fall of the Iron Curtain turned the spotlight onto domestic issues. It wasn't all peaches and cream. Story 11. It was the end of the age of innocence when it comes to schools and gun violence. Once the Columbine incident happened, it was as if all future generations of children had to live in a reality where they might one day get shot just for going to school. Story 12. Paying by the minute for long-distance phone calls. As a university student, my friends and I each regularly paid $300 to $400 a month in long-distance bills, essentially doubling our rent. Story 13. It started as a decade with a lot of hype before it happened. The recession changed that and depressed everyone. The Gulf War, Operation Desert Shield. Generation X had a very cynical and pessimistic outlook on the world, compared to the 1980s when they were more happy and optimistic. Everyone kept saying, "The 90s came and I lost everything." Anti-gay people kept calling the 1990s the gay 90s, as there were a lot of TV shows and movies in the 1990s with at least one token gay character, especially in the years 1995 to 1999. Racial hostility came back again, which was something that had cooled off in the late 1970s and the entire 1980s. The media portrayed black people as street thugs that spoke Ebonics in TV shows. Even Jaleel White talked about this and how he was treated as Steve Urkel on Family Matters in the real world and how he did not fit the black stereotype of the time in America. Same with jokes about Hillary and Carlton being too white because they were not black enough. And the jokes about Will Smith only enforced negative stereotypes about black people in America at the time, which did not help. But Jaleel White was treated the most harshly back then in real life. High rates of antidepressant usage among Americans were a problem, especially Prozac. It was prescribed as the wonder drug back then and prescribed widely, ignoring warnings about Osama bin Laden 5 times throughout the 1990s. Products began to be made even cheaper than they were already made in the 1970s and 1980s, but it lowered the price of products such as videocassette recorders, computers, and blank tapes, which were priced higher in the 1980s, but the quality was better. Ironically, those old recordings from the 1980s hold up longer than the recordings from the 1990s. Just look at many old commercials on YouTube. The commercials from the 1980s often have better detail, better color contrast, and are sharper. The footage from the 1990s is softer, the color contrast is more blurry and more artificial looking, and many of the 1990s recordings were recorded with the audio too low, which resulted in a lot of tape hiss or metallic ringing in the audio. I remember noticing this at the time as well, and I had top-of-the-line videocassette recorders and Super VHS recorders at the time, but it was still not as good as the two-head videocassette recorder from 1985 I had, and the videocassette recorders made before then, and the same with the blank tapes. They were made more flimsy and cheaper. In the 1980s, cable boxes still used the default audio volume of the TV. That was why, but in the 1990s, the volume was controlled through only the cable box, so the audio would be different when watching a videotape or DVD, and the volume you had it at the time was how it recorded, and you would notice it later on. They started fixing this again by 1999 with digital cable, but it was already too late, so many recordings were ruined because of it. The internet was still very slow. Video from the internet was still very low quality. Late 1990s. A music file would take 45 minutes to several hours or days to download one song. Late 1990s. That is really all I can think of at the moment. Story 14. Not the worst thing given the genocides, which I'm sure have been mentioned. I was going to say the heroin chic era. Body image has never recovered. Story 15. Watching my favorite baseball team lose 4 World Series. Braves fans' agony was only exceeded by Bills fans. At least we got to see the mountaintop once. Story 16. Lack of health knowledge and consideration. Lack of iPhones and Androids. Other than that, nothing really. It feels like the economy was much better, and people had access to better retirement. The flavor of the 90s is amazing. Great music, movies, video games, outside fun. Where I live, it was a great combination of new commerce being built, but still having a lot of space as it was only starting to grow. If I could time travel with no repercussions, I'd bring my family back to the 80s and 90s. Story 17. Parenting was incredibly checked out to the point of being emotionally neglectful. Many of us were latchkey kids from young ages with 2 parents working long hours. There seemed to be a culture around parents' needs and wants coming first, so even when their workday was done, they would often focus on their own activities like gym, choir, book club, and gaming. The intensive parenting that millennials now engage in is a massive overcorrection, but I can see why many did so. Story 18. Slow internet service. The AIDS epidemic was a huge crisis, and we did not have the medications for it that we do now. Millions of people had to die before the government would take it seriously because it was considered gay cancer. Much higher crime. No resources like YouTube for tutorials on how to do things like cooking or changing a tire. If you didn't have parents to teach you things and guide you, you were literally on your own. It was considered cool to be stupid in high school. Nerds were mercilessly teased and bullied for being smart and working hard. There is still a little of that going on today, but it's more acceptable now to be nerdy and knowledgeable about how the world works. Story 19. It really depends on where you were. In Japan, there was the economic crash that marked the end of the bubble era, and the 1995 terrorist attacks by Aum Shinrikyo. Story 20. Having to use a payphone. Cell phone plans. Technology. Long-distance service. Dial-up. Slow internet. Computers did not do as much. Cell phones could only make calls, nothing else. No music players. Cigarette smoke everywhere. Signing up for college courses by phone. Touch tone. Story 21. The over-sexualization of everything. Back then, it was very normal to even sexualize children. Britney Spears was like 16, I think, when Hit Me Baby One More Time came out, for example. Story 22. Serious answer. Rwandan genocide. Unserious answer. If you missed an episode of a television show or a television special of some kind, you had to just live with the knowledge that it may be gone forever. It's not like that internet thing you saw on television once was going to take off, and even if it did, it's not like they'll invent a way to watch just about any show ever made. Story 23. Block parent program. They forgot to background check those they approved to be a block parent. One too many pedophiles signed up for the straight-to-your-door service and got approved. Story 24. False sense of hope that the world wasn't going to burn. The Cold War was over. Peace seemed to be breaking out in a lot of places that made the news. Story 25. Rampant homophobia. Like anything you did was gay and made you a fag. Like people just started being accepting to where they wouldn't get as violent, but just bullied people instead of trying to maim them. But then everyone was saying things like that constantly. Story 26. Homophobia, sexism, racism. There were major riots in the United States due to the beating of Rodney King. We had one of the worst mass shootings in Australia that caused us all to say enough is enough and outlaw semi-automatic firearms and bring in common-sense gun laws. But sure, internet speeds were poor also. Story 27. Criminal Justice Act stopping your freedom to party anywhere all night. Before that, no one really cared what you did at night. Also, mass rollout of closed-circuit television mass surveillance everywhere as well here in the United Kingdom. Story 28. Strangely enough, I just started watching a series called Dark Side of the 90s yesterday. Pretty interesting. I don't remember Beanie Babies at all. One of the actresses from Beverly Hills 90210 said she wasn't supposed to hug a black actor. Dancing guy from Fresh Prince? Because middle America doesn't want that. So she kissed and hugged him. But shows in the 90s were pushing boundaries more than the 80s, I guess. But then you think further back to Archie Bunker and George Jefferson, that seemed more progressive than a lot of stuff ever since. Story 29. Little to no access to anti-human immunodeficiency virus drugs. Some infected people sold their life insurance policies to third-party businesses for pennies on the dollar, either to be able to afford the medications or to cash out their policies, because they didn't think they had much longer to live. Story 30. Single mothers were still vilified, but dating culture and even casual sex culture were accepted. Single fathers? What consequences? The mother should have made sure this didn't happen to inconvenience him. Story 31. It was really difficult to get a hold of nude images if you were under 18. When I heard my governor was blocking pornographic sites for minors, I thought, good, work for it, you little perverts. Story 32. It depends on a country. But in Russia specifically, crime and corruption were prevalent. It was called the Wild 90s because of bloody mobster wars and people killing each other over the ownership of some bread kiosk. This was considered the norm. Story 33. Average unemployment of 5.6%, mortgage rates as high as 9.9%. Violent crime was historically high, discrimination was way worse than now. Bullying and demonizing were a lot worse than now. Many metrics were worse in the 1990s than now. Story 34. Creepy woods. Adult magazines. Guys would hide them in the woods in creepy places for people to find. And they were used, so yes, it was bad. You weren't a boy in the 1990s if you didn't have a disgusting adult magazine you found in the woods somewhere. Story 35. It's hard to pinpoint. I've got almost nothing but good memories from those years. Haha. If I had to pick one thing, maybe it would be people's closed-mindedness about certain things that are now just part of our everyday lives. Story 36. There were still smoking sections, and it didn't really matter that there would be only 5 tables in the section. You'd smell cigarette smoke immediately when entering a restaurant. Also, my dad's blue-collar trade job was the only income in our home. So when the recession hit, it was extremely difficult for a few years for our family just to pay for essentials. Story 37. Casual homophobia was at a very high level. I believe that strides made in the 1960s and 1970s with gay rights and increased tolerance and acceptance of gay people were completely undermined by both the AIDS epidemic that intensified during the 1980s and an increasing presence of evangelical Christian religious influence in all forms of United States society, but notably in the political realm. While it was a better time for gay people than, say, the 1950s, it was definitely a big step backward in terms of general opinion and the comfort level many gay people had in coming out, especially in small towns or conservative areas. I do believe that towards the end of the decade things were getting better, but they were nothing like things are today. One of the nicer, younger, and more generally cool teachers in my high school would routinely call things she didn't like gay in class, and nobody really batted an eye.